Good evening. My name is Michelle Stempian, Education and Community Programs Manager at the Holland Museum, and I use the pronouns she and her. Thank you for joining us virtually this evening for what I'm sure will be an engaging conversation as our speakers share an historical context for Latinx immigration to West Michigan, telling some important stories that are often overlooked. Before we get started, I have a few announcements and information to share. Tonight's program is part of the Holland Museum Cultural Lens series, which centers the stories, experiences, and voices of our diverse Holland community through talks, discussions, and family programs. We are grateful for the continued support of Spectrum Health Zeeland Hospital and Warner Norcross and Judd, with additional support from the Holland Zeeland Community Foundation and Herman Miller Cares. We also thank the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts. This program is being recorded. Please remain on mute throughout the presentations. If you have any questions, you may enter them in the chat and we will share them during the Q&A sections. Links to the program recording and a program survey will be emailed tomorrow to our program participants. We appreciate you sharing your thoughts about this and future programs. Tonight's program is also our last program in support of our current exhibition. If you haven't yet, we hope you will come by the museum to explore United for Progress, the story of LAUP, which will run through January 17th. Since 1964, LAUP, Latin Americans United for Progress, has been a driving force for change in the Holland community, focusing on a wide range of topics, including education, cultural activities, community involvement, and discrimination. The exhibition explores this organization's history, how they've evolved, and how they continue to serve the Latinx and Greater Holland community. The museum's current hours are Monday, Friday, and Saturday from 10 to 5. We are always open the second Monday of the month in the evening from 4 to 7 for free. Our next programs celebrate history, diversity, and inclusion as we enter the holiday season. On December 11th, join us from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. at the Capon House for a walkthrough of this Victorian era home with museum docents, learn about Victorian holiday traditions, and enjoy an art activity and hot cocoa in the visitor center. Then come over to the museum from 1 to 4 for holidays around the world, where visitors will learn about a variety of holidays through stories and family-friendly activities. We thank our program partners, Latin Americans United for Progress, Empowering Youth Global Connection, I Am Academy, and the Alliance for Culture and Ethnic Harmony for working with us to bring this new program to the community. For more information on these and other museum programs, please visit the Holland Museum website at hollandmuseum.org. As we continue to offer these programs at little or no cost so we can be as accessible as possible to the community, we hope you will support our efforts with a donation to the Holland Museum. We also have unique items in the gift shop, and remember, memberships make great gifts, especially during the holiday season, but also all year long, and thank you. So on to tonight's program. It is my privilege to introduce our presenters for this evening. Sarah Yore-VanOosterhout completed her undergraduate studies at Calvin College in 2008. Sarah attended the Michigan State University College of Law, devoting herself to the study of immigration and public interest law. In the fall of 2013, Sarah started work at the Diocese of Grand Rapids Immigration Legal Services, serving as one of 2 full-time attorneys. She tackled a wide variety of family-based immigration cases and grew accustomed to handling high-volume caseload while still offering high-quality legal services. Sarah left the Diocese of Grand Rapids in December 2014 and soon discovered for-profit legal services were not what Holland immigrants needed. And so she pioneered Lighthouse Immigrant Advocates. Yore-VanOosterhout has worked as a research manager at the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University since 2017. In this role, he designs and conducts a variety of community-based research projects on topics ranging from homelessness and post-secondary education in prison. Aaron has a doctorate in history from Michigan State University with a focus on race and ethnicity in anti-state rebellion in 19th century Mexico. Before joining the Johnson Center, he taught Latin American history at a number of colleges and universities, most recently at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. Thank you to both of our presenters for being here this evening, and I will now turn the screen over to Sarah and Aaron.
Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. We really appreciate it. It's our privilege to be here with all of you tonight. So we really look forward to just presenting what we have, and hopefully we'll hear from you and have a good conversation as well. So thank you all for attending. We appreciate it.
Share screen too. Bear with me. I'm terrible with technology here. And did that work?
Sure.
There we go. Good. Is everybody seeing?
Does everyone see the title screen there?
Because we're not seeing you.
And we can't see you, so if someone wouldn't mind unmuting and just confirming, that would be helpful.
We can't see it yet.
Yeah, not seeing it yet.
Okay.
Try again.
Try one more time.
Oh, here we go. Share.
Now we can, or it's coming up.
That works. Yep.
Good.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
All right. So we're gonna just bounce ahead here a couple of slides. So this is us. We are husband and wife presenters for you tonight. I'm sure. I know it's not unique for us. We often get talked to or asked to speak together, and it just happens that our two career paths align in such a way that we are able to talk about similar issues. And so, but maybe for you, it's unusual to have presenters who, yeah, have been together for the last 2 decades. And so, yeah. But this is us. So I'm Sarah. This is Aaron. Both of the last name Yore-VanOosterhout. And I currently work at Lighthouse Immigrant Advocates, which is where we're actually presenting from right now. We are a small nonprofit immigration law office and advocacy center located in Holland, Michigan, if you haven't heard of us before. And we're doing lots of really amazing work. And so if you have a minute, please check us out on our website, la-michigan.org. And I don't know, do you need to say anything about your work? Or are you good?
No, I mean, Michelle said it at the beginning. Also check out the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy at your leisure as well. Yep. Thank you again.
All right, so we're going to jump into our presentation. We have a lot of material for you tonight, and so we want to make sure that we get through it. So we're going to skip all the niceties and go to the not so niceties. So up on your screen, you've got some pretty grisly looking pictures. And so this is a little weird for me. I'm really much more comfortable presenting in person and seeing your reaction to these grotesque photos in live. So what I want you to do instead in this remote format is to weigh in the chat boxes. And Michelle, maybe if you could help us by just shouting out what people are putting into those chat boxes. What are we looking at on the screen here? So start with that one. Can we bring up the chat box? So I can see too. All right. Aliens from Linda. Clay, aliens. Scary, violent. Thanks, Ken. So yeah, we're looking at aliens, obviously. What other words are coming to mind as you examine the images up on the screen? Unknown, not human, monsters, threatening, aliens equals people groups we don't understand. Yeah. And then what feelings? Just think, what are your gut reactions? What sort of visceral reaction do you have to some of these images up on the screen? Fear. Can I make the presentation screen larger? What?
Michelle, I'm not sure how to make the presentation screen larger. How does it appear on other people's?
It fills my screen. So the person who needs that, they have to adjust it on their own screen.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay.
Got it.
Yeah.
Scary, repulsion. Yeah, exactly. Like that word, aliens, brings to mind these particular images. So I want to focus on that word alien for just a minute. So is this going to let me bounce forward? Yeah. So this was a word that was first used by George Washington, and we think it's been around since about 1790. And only now is it slowly being removed from legal writings because of the dehumanizing nature of the term. So in 2016, actually, the Library of Congress decided to stop using this word. And then only this year, under the Biden administration, did U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services decide it would stop using the word alien and the phrase illegal alien in its own writings. According to a directive from the U.S. CIS Director, Tracy Renaud, the word alien will be replaced with non-citizen. Illegal alien will be replaced with undocumented citizen or non-citizen or undocumented individual. And other problematic terms such as assimilation replaced with integration or civic integration. But it's a word really that's still widely used by courts because it's still written into the governing body of law, the Immigration and Nationality Act, and by the general populace when referring to people not citizens of the United States. We just had a news story published about our organization, and one of the anchors, in fact, did use this word. So it's still widely used, and people don't really think twice about using it because, again, it's written into the governing body of law when we're talking about this particular population. Just as an example, I presented yesterday at Grand Valley State University, and one of the individuals in the audience shared with me an anecdotal story about his own childhood. And he said, when I was about 8 or 9, my brother and I heard someone refer to our dad, who at the time was a permanent resident, so not a citizen. They referred to him as an alien. And he and his brother, as 8 and 9-year-olds, are both like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. And they're picturing their dad wearing a human mask over a top of an alien face. So, they said, we pictured he had like this green alien face underneath of it, kind of Men in Black style. But I feel like that story is really telling because it shows just the way that we perceive this particular word. I mean, even as a child, we recognize it as something scary, something foreign, something from another planet, something monster. And so think about it from an 8 or 9-year-old's perspective, to think continually that is his father's identity, alien, or even as a child who's being referred to as alien, that really influences our sense of self. And then when we're thinking about others, that influences the way that we think about other people. Alien is just one of those many problematic words that we use when we're talking about or in association with the immigrant debate. Some other examples, immigration debate is even problematic. It's seemingly innocuous, but it sends a message that immigration is something that must be debated, that it's a problem in and of itself. Illegal is another word used in association with immigrants. Threat to public safety, terrorism, unpaid taxes or burden on the welfare system, job competition, healthcare costs, draining social services, gangs and delinquents, drug dealers, violent criminals, rapists. As I often say to my 11-year-old embellisher and tall tale teller, words matter. How we talk about a population not only impacts how we see them, but how they see themselves. So throughout today's presentation, you're going to hear me, at least, I don't know if Erin's going to use the term, but you'll hear us use the term other or othering or immigrant other. And I wanted to explain a little bit about what we mean when we're using this term or phrase. Other or othering is the way humans define and secure their own positive identity through the stigmatization of an other. We often do so by focusing on markers of social differentiation, such as race, geography, ethnicity, economics, or ideologies. Othering is often used interchangeably with words like racism, xenophobia, nativism, and discrimination. And at the very least, they are related concepts, but not necessarily the same. Othering creates a power imbalance, resulting in an atmosphere of us versus them. Othering is most often done by another more powerful person or group, and it's often used as a method to dehumanize or devalue or destroy groups seen as other or as a threat to the dominant groups. So as you can imagine, especially following the example set by the last administration, immigrants are particularly susceptible to othering. First, they often speak a different language. They have different cultural practices, and they may even dress or look different. They're identifiable often externally as different from the dominant social groups. So think about the incoming group of Afghan New Americans. They speak a different language. They oftentimes wear very different clothing, especially when we're talking about the women. They even wear sandals in the snow. We've had a couple of folks show up wearing sandals to our clinics, and they have very different cultural practices and norms. At our office, we've had to learn how to interact differently with these folks. And those practices are often conflicting with those norms around them. And so it's easy to identify, easy to pick them out. So especially in West Michigan, the new Americans stand out and they're vulnerable to othering because we're afraid of what we don't know yet. The otherization is further exacerbated by the federal government, which not only gives them a legal identity of other as alien, but also labels them as outside the law and opts for a designation of potential danger. Think of that word alien, illegal alien, and then all of the associated words. The crazy thing is, not only does this impact how the us views them, but how the them views them. Stereotype threat is a phenomenon that has been observed in situations where certain populations have an opportunity to fulfill a particular stereotype, usually in academic settings related to race or gender. And I really, at this point, don't want to take any time to dive into the details of this, but feel free to take the time to read about it. It's really fascinating. But you get the general idea. How we treat and perceive the other can impact how the other then perceives themselves, and in turn, how they behave in social settings. If we treat someone like a stranger, they'll act like a stranger. If we treat them like a friend or a neighbor, they'll act like a friend or a neighbor. So as we proceed through tonight's talk, keep this in mind. Exclusion takes three forms. We have physical exclusion, which comes in the form of detention or deportation. We have social exclusion, and as a result, and this happens as a result of the labels and the harmful myths branded by mainstream society. And then finally, we have civil exclusion due to the inability to participate in the rights given to those granted citizenship, like voting. So let's look at some more harmful messaging, and I want you to take a couple of seconds to weigh in again in the chat box. What are the impacts of this type of messaging on an immigrant population? Anybody? Unwelcome. Thanks, Ken. No hospitality. Unwelcoming, to put it mildly. Thanks, Ricky. Criminal. Yeah, absolutely. So fearful. Thanks again. Not safe. Absolutely. Not safe is a great one. Fear. So they're feeling fear in response to our fear. So in a really great article written by Douglas Epps and Richard Furman, it's an article I'll refer to a couple times throughout tonight's presentation. They write, othering immigrants creates a need to react from a defensive position, erecting barriers, screening and deterring, defending borders, and effectively guarding against contact and confrontation. When people in authority, particularly governments, engage in othering, it both defines and normalizes othering. And keep in mind, othering is not about liking or disliking someone or liking or disliking a group. It is the conscious or unconscious assumption that a particular group is a threat to the dominant or favored group. It is often driven by politics and media as opposed to personal contact. In fact, overwhelmingly, people do not know those they are othering. And not only do we not know those we are othering, but we often do not know we are othering. I'm sure we can all think of a time when we've engaged in some kind of othering behavior. The deeper dive we, especially me personally, take into understanding how my brain is programmed and these ingrained ideas about other people and groups, the more I discover ways that I've engaged in othering, and I catch myself in the act of othering, and I'm sure you can probably think of times when this has happened. It comes so naturally that we don't always realize that we're doing it, and it's hard to get our brain's wheels out of those ruts they've been driving in for so many years. So think of this precursor as your trendy tote bag, in which you can store all of the information you're going to learn tonight. And trust me, there will be lots of it. Within that othering tote bag, you're going to hold information about how the US has a long history of intentionally designing anti-immigrant and racist laws, policies and campaigns that feed on people's fear of the other or unknown. And you need to understand the human psychology and sociology behind why these policies have functioned this way in order to really understand the harm that has and is being done. Unfortunately, anti-immigrant propaganda throughout history is kind of like pollution. We can really never be rid of it. In my mind, I liken it to the problems we're having right now with PFAS in drinking water. Dumping of chemicals before we understood the impacts of dumping chemicals, or maybe we did understand, but we just didn't care, resulted in the poisoning of soil and water supplies for generations to come. Similarly, anti-immigrant laws and policies are the chemical dumping into the waterways of society. And those policies and laws will have lasting and harmful impacts on society for generations to come, unless we take steps to neutralize the damage. And even then, there are some things we just can't fix. So recognizing the tropes, the false rhetoric, the propaganda, becoming aware of bad history repeating itself, and confronting certain powerful members of society who are continually reinforcing the fear of other is one of the first steps in cleaning up the mess created by harmful immigration policy. And the other part of this is understanding the context within which our immigrant neighbors live and how that impacts them psychologically, physically, and emotionally. And this is the context for the ethnically diverse immigrant in the United States. From the very beginning, immigration law has been about excluding people. It's about telling people that they don't belong. Again, quoting Epps and Furman, there is a tendency to view refugees and immigrants not as human beings, but in terms of their perceived worth, as we welcome immigrants when there is a clear need for labor and mark them return to sender after they have served their purpose. Even within Ottawa County, we have a tendency to define the worth of equity and inclusion work or refugees or immigrants in general by their relative economic value to the county. This is in and of itself extremely dehumanizing and othering. So let's get to it finally, to the presentation. All right, so just a roadmap for where we're going tonight. We're going to start off, or we started off with understanding othering and exclusion and how this fits into the immigrant narrative. Erin's going to follow up with the history of immigration law, and policy in the United States, and also a history of Latinx immigration to West Michigan. We use the term Latinx because it's more gender inclusive, and we do recognize that it may not be a term that's super popular with Spanish-speaking populations, as it's kind of hard to pronounce in the Spanish language. But just for inclusivity's sake, when we're speaking English, we choose to use Latinx. And then finally, I'm going to close us out with a present-day immigration law and policy review, and then those impacts on our community. And then we'll wrap up. Hopefully we can get it all in before 8:30. So the main message we want you to take away tonight: U.S. immigration policy has always been about exclusion. It defines who cannot enter, who does not belong, and who needs to leave. All right, so just wanted to pause here and see if anyone has any questions or reflections that they'd like to share with the group. We'll have another opportunity to ask questions. And all right. Are you able to see the chat screen?
Okay.
Okay.
If there are no questions, we'll move along. So for my portion of the presentation, I'll cover in broad strokes 4 different topics. First, we'll walk through U.S. immigration policy from the late 19th century to the 1960s. Understanding this history is key to understanding why the U.S. population looks the way it does and why the United States acts the way it does toward immigrants. Second, we'll zoom in a little and look specifically at Latin American immigration to the United States, again, in the same time period. Third, we'll zoom in yet again and spend a minute discussing Latin American immigration to the U.S. Midwest. Fourth, and finally, I'd also like to spend a few minutes talking about Mexican-American political activism around the time that LAUP was founded. As Alfredo Gonzalez, one of the founders of LAUP, pointed out in his panel discussion earlier this year, this activism fed into LAUP's origins in Holland. Okay, first, U.S. immigration policy. Generally speaking, and this is something that Sarah just elaborated on, right? U.S. immigration policy centers on preventing certain types of people from crossing an imaginary border. When speaking of U.S. immigration agencies, we are essentially discussing an entire bureaucracy devoted to the construction and buttressing of race. Let's go back to the roots. Ben Franklin's always good for a quote. Plus, he's a familiar face. His statue, after all, sits only about a block and a half from the museum. Here we have him commenting on German immigration into New England in the mid-18th century. And here you can see it on the screen, but he's saying, why should the Palatine Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of us Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? Now, I include this quote not to anachronistically and judgmentally point the finger at Franklin's racism here, but rather to demonstrate how clearly his ideas have survived unaltered to the present day. You could update the language here and attribute this to a US legislator today, and few would be surprised, I think. Note, for instance, the verbs swarm and herding when referring to groups of human beings. Note Franklin's fear of language loss, of culture loss, and perhaps most significantly, his comment about skin color. Right, this passage here formed part of a broader memo he had written, and he later writes in that memo that preferring people of one's own skin color is, quote, natural to mankind, end quote. Perhaps he should have said instead, right, that our instinctive reaction is to alienate others we perceive to be different. Nevertheless, Ben Franklin's musings aside, before the late 19th century, the US government largely maintained an open attitude to immigration. Of course, nativist policies still underlay this period. As early as 1790, Congress restricted naturalization to, quote, free white persons. But by and large, the government's position for the next 100 years was relatively laissez-faire. This all changed in the 1880s. Prior to this point, Chinese laborers migrated to the United States to work on the expanding network of railroads. But after construction slowed, thousands of workers were tossed back onto the job market, and Western states began clamoring for their removal. As so often happens, this labor measure melded with existing racial stereotypes and misogyny. Proponents of what would become the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 decried the, quote, yellow peril, besieging the country from the West, bringing with it opium addiction and female prostitution. And after promulgation of this law, violence against Chinese and Chinese American communities ensued, such as the murder of nearly 30 people in Rock Springs, Wyoming, and the forced flight of some 600 in 1885. The Chinese Exclusion Act was originally set up to expire after a decade, and so it was extended and made more restrictive in the 1892 Geary Act. This statute removed a presumption of innocence and placed the burden upon the individual to prove their citizenship. The Geary Act established that, quote, any Chinese person or person of Chinese descent was deemed to be in the country illegally unless he or she could demonstrate otherwise, end quote. This built-in distrust of people of Chinese descent extended, of course, to people immigrating to the country as well. Most of you are likely familiar with Ellis Island, the famous entry point for European immigrants in New York Harbor. Well, Angel Island in San Francisco Bay was the entry point for people coming into the Western United States. Unlike European immigrants on the other side of the country, Chinese applicants on Angel Island were, quote, subjected to extreme or intense cross-examination and humiliating physical exams, including taking stool samples. The rejection rate on Angel Island was an estimated 18%. By point of comparison, the rejection rate at Ellis Island was around 1% for most of its existence. To wrap up this early history, I'd like to read a passage from historian Roger Daniels, because he sums up well predominant attitudes among immigration officials of the time and the political apparatus supporting them. Here's Daniels, quote, most immigration officials concluded that Chinese were born liars and could not be trusted under any circumstances. As a result, they tended to treat all Chinese entrants as if they were criminals. It was relatively easy for these attitudes to shift from Chinese immigrants to other immigrants, particularly because a whole series of immigration commissioners drawn from the ranks of trade unions came to their posts with built-in prejudices against immigrants and persistently urged Congress to enact further restrictions. While the Department of Agriculture spoke for farmers, the Department of Labor spoke for working people, and the Forest Service looked out for the trees, the Immigration Service, which became the Immigration and Naturalization Service in 1933, lobbied against the interests of legal immigrants, especially those of color and those who seemed to them un-American, end quote. As Chinese immigration dwindled in the face of restrictive policy, immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe intensified. From 1901 to 1910, some 8 million Europeans arrived. 2/3 of them were from countries such as Greece, Hungary, Italy, Poland, and Russia. Eugenics, of course, and social Darwinism were also in vogue within the scientific community and increasingly embraced by politicians. It should come as no surprise then that immigration policy adopted a particularly virulent racism in this period. According to the United States Immigration Commission in 1911, quote, "The old immigration movement was essentially one of permanence. The new immigration is very largely one of individuals, a considerable proportion of whom apparently have no intention of permanently changing their residence. Their only purpose in coming to America being to temporarily take advantage of the greater wages paid for industrial labor in this country." Keep in mind that that was said in 1911, right? I think most politicians say similar things about the immigration today, right? And in fact, refer to earlier waves of immigration as being interested in permanence. In 1911, that wasn't what was actually being said. In fact, as millions of these, quote, "new immigrants" entered the country, the US Congress adopted a decidedly restrictionist position on immigration built on racist prejudice. For example, in 1921, the director of the US Consular Bureau called Jewish applicants from Germany and Poland, quote, "a class of economic parasites who were filthy, un-American, and dangerous in their habits." That was about, it was spoken about Jewish applicants from Germany and Poland in 1921. Until the late 1940s, immigration offices and Congress alike took steps to prevent Jewish immigration into the United States during World War II, mind you. This prejudice wasn't restricted to Jewish emigres. Similar views were echoed at the time by Albert Johnson, who led the House Immigration Committee. In 1923, Johnson was elected president of the Eugenics Research Association. In the next year, a bill he co-authored, the most restrictive to that point in US history, became law. In addition to expanding Chinese exclusion to all Asian peoples, the law set in place quotas on immigrants from other national origins. Legislators based these quotas on percentages of the population as shown in the 1890 census, before many Southern and Eastern Europeans had arrived. Thus, while 220,000 Italian and 95,000 Polish immigrants arrived in 1921 alone, only 4,000 and 6,000 respectively would be allowed to enter each year after 1924. And we must note that national origin, then as now, was simply a proxy for perceived race. As Johnson explained at the time, quote, "The United States is our land. The day of unalloyed welcome to all peoples, the day of indiscriminate acceptance of all races, has definitely ended." All right, let's leave broader US immigration policy there for the moment. Let's head to our second point. In some ways, immigration from Latin America had its own unique history. We'll get into that now. But in other significant ways, it was subject to the same nativist impulses. So let's revisit the 19th century real quick. Sarah and I recently visited family in San Antonio, Texas, and we took the kids to see the Alamo, the Spanish colonial era chapel for the Misión de San Antonio de Valero. The Alamo, of course, represented one of the early skirmishes between Mexico and the United States that culminated in the Mexican-American War. And just as a quick aside, because this is just top of mind, having been to the Alamo just in the last week or two, let's not forget that the Battle of the Alamo and the war for Texas's independence from Mexico was largely fought to preserve slavery, which Mexico had outlawed years before. I haven't read it yet, but there's a new book out that discusses this in more detail called Forget the Alamo. I encourage you all to check that out. Okay, setting aside that tangent, back to our topic. Of course, we must recognize that the first significant immigration of people from Mexico was actually no immigration at all. The US border simply moved over them. After Mexico was defeated in the Mexican-American War in 1848, the two countries signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ceded more than half of Mexico's territory to the United States. Thousands of Mexicans thus instantly became US citizens. Although the treaty ensured they would be granted civil rights, these new Americans were soon subject to existing and newly crafted race-based laws, preventing some from voting, others from marrying Anglo women, etc. Within a few decades, only a few decades after the war, 90% of new US citizens in the Southwest had lost their land and were obligated to re-enter the economy as wage laborers. The next big push came from the Mexican Revolution, a bloody civil war that caused roughly 1.5 million Mexicans to flee north of the US border between 1910 and 1930. Mexico, in turn, lost about 10% of its population at this time. Now, skipping ahead, remember the Immigration Act of 1924? We just discussed it, right? It prohibited all Asian immigration and established quotas on European immigration. Well, importantly, that law placed no constraints on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. However, it bears emphasizing here that our hemispheric neighbors were allowed primarily for labor purposes. And when the demand for labor dried up, as it did during the Great Depression of the 1930s, this population was just as vulnerable as any other quote unquote undesirable group. From 1929 to 39, that is, immediately after the worst atrocities of the Mexican Revolution had ended, roughly 1/3 of all people of Mexican heritage living in the United States, 1/3 of all people of Mexican heritage living in the United States, as many as 2 million people, were sent to Mexico. Of that quote unquote repatriation, as it was called, likely some 60% were US citizens. Well, we know what happens next. The United States entered World War II and once again needed laborers to work in positions vacated by departing US soldiers. The bracero program soon began as a result. And here, keep in mind, the word bracero derives from the Spanish word for arm, right? The English equivalent would be farmhand. This guest worker system was in place from 1942 until 1965. Under this program, the Mexican government was responsible for recruiting braceros and depositing a portion of their wages in a Mexican bank to encourage the workers to return home. US employers were obligated to pay wages, quote, comparable to those of domestic workers, end quote, and provide decent living and working conditions. As we know, these conditions were rarely, if ever, met. The labor regime in Texas was notoriously racist and brutal, pushing guest workers to venture farther north for marginally better conditions, of course, with the trade-off of social isolation. Overall, the result was an economic underclass that, as we have seen, could be removed at will and violently. Indeed, within a decade after World War II, the US government once again attempted mass exile. In 1954, the Eisenhower administration placed a retired general in charge of the Immigration and Naturalization Service and ordered him to round up and deport undocumented Mexican immigrants in a military-style operation called Operation Wetback. Then Attorney General Herbert Brownell explained that this maneuver was necessary to, quote, wipe out the disease, criminal activity, juvenile delinquency, and social instability that attends any wetback invasion, unquote. Over the course of a few months, anywhere from 250,000 to 1 million people were caught up in the dragnet. Then, as now, the United States government was not particularly interested in keeping track of people they picked up and shipped out. And again, many were US citizens. Dozens perished as suspected undocumented immigrants were grabbed from across the US Southwest and as far north as Chicago, then driven into the desert across the Mexican border and dropped off. In one roundup, some 90 people died of sunstroke. Others drowned as they were transported to Mexico by ship unsafely. Although the Immigration and Naturalization Service declared the operation a success, it was eventually suspended after a public outcry in Mexico. All right. So on the one hand, we have an entire immigration system designed to exclude certain people that the dominant class found undesirable for various reasons. And that undesirability was expressed and legislated against in racist terms, as we have seen with people of Latin American descent. On to our third point here. How did this look in the Midwest? So the first sizable Mexican population arrived in the Midwest during World War I to work in the sugar beet fields. At the time, other Midwestern families were drawn to cities by rising wartime wages, and other Midwesterners began to rent and purchase land and refused wage labor in the fields. In response, many employers turned to Mexico. Remember, the revolution was raging at this time. So they turned to Mexico for a cheaper source of labor. Agricultural interests lobbied to insert a special clause in the U.S. Immigration Act of 1917, and beet companies later convinced the Secretary of Labor to maintain that clause after the war. By 1920, the Michigan, Columbia, Continental, and Holland St. Louis sugar companies had recruited more than 5,000 Mexican men to work in the Ohio and Michigan beet fields with promises of high pay and good working conditions. But across the Midwest, these promises were by and large not kept. Company representatives complained that their workers were abandoning their contracts and heading for more lucrative work in cities and mid-sized towns. Investigators were sent in to see what was happening, and they found that Mexican field laborers were typically placed in the most poorly cultivated fields, those abandoned by other workers. Furthermore, child labor was rampant and especially pernicious. When entire Mexican families came north in the 1920s, children as young as 6 were put to work, and severe health and developmental problems were the result. In addition, discrimination was widespread in this period. Beet company representatives attempted to counter this discrimination by extolling the values of Mexican workers, but they inadvertently ended up perpetuating other stereotypes. As one Michigan company rep claimed in 1923, quote, "Much of the Mexican population is descended directly from the Indian. He has by nature the inherent traits of that race. He is fundamentally rural. He prefers outdoor life to the confinement of industrial pursuits." End quote. And as he continued to try and calm the fears that Mexicans would put down roots in Michigan, he said, quote, "It is a weird complex the Mexican seems to have in his makeup that he is migratory." End quote. Well, disappointed by conditions in the beet fields, Mexican laborers in Holland looked for other jobs. Many remained in agriculture, cultivating and picking strawberries, blueberries, pickles, celery, onions, peaches, even flowers and Christmas trees. Others turned to industry, working in the Holland St. Louis sugar beet factory and the Heinz pickling works. And despite that company rep's prediction, many Mexicans and their families chose to settle in the Holland area. Looking ahead, by 1970, the percentage of Latinos in the region's population was 5 times the state average. In fact, as we know from subsequent census data, right between 1980 and 2000, people of Latin American descent overall grew from 13 to 22% of Holland's population. By 2005, that figure had reached 25%. And keep in mind that of that amount, roughly 80% of the population was of Mexican descent particularly. Now, meanwhile, by the mid-20th century, many people of Latin American descent and primarily of Mexican descent, again, as I've just suggested here, many people of Latin American descent lived in the United States and had been here for generations. This is, again, we're jumping ahead to the mid-20th century. So on to our fourth point. What was the national cultural milieu that LAUP emerged from in the 1960s? The answer? Well, it's a bit complicated. On one hand, many people of Latin American descent formed and joined ethnicity-based organizations in the early to mid-20th century, advocating for civil rights, fair wages, and equal treatment under the law. There are many examples, but let's just list a few here. First, We have here the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, formed in 1929. And this formed amid remember, the eugenicism and tribalism of the early 1900s. Right? Another example, we have pastor cum land rights activist Reyes Lopez Tijerina, who began his struggle against racist public education and land expropriation in the 1950s, culminating in an armed raid on a courthouse in New Mexico in 1967. And of course, Cesar Chavez established the union that would become the United Farm Workers in 1962. The strike and boycott that he helped organize against California grape growers eventually resulted in union contracts for farm workers in 1970, establishing improved working conditions and higher wages. Again, there were others, La Raza Unida, the GI Forum, later the Brown Berets, the quote, Chicano movement overall, right? I raise these three in particular, I'll say, because actually they all three have a connection to LAUP. In fact, LAUP has very recently partnered with LULAC, and LAUP has hosted both Reyes Lopez Tijerina and Cesar Chavez here in Holland during their heyday, right, during their days of protest. And so these figures here are all associated with Holland in some way. But complicating this somewhat, right? On the other hand, as with many national civil rights movements, there were ideological divides in tactics and definitions of just who exactly could belong. Perhaps most notoriously, LULAC initially supported Operation Wetback in 1954, drawing a line between themselves and US citizens and undocumented immigrants. Cesar Chavez also drew this line for the UFW, maintaining the position that undocumented workers posed a threat to US citizen laborers, and he called for their removal. Now, keep in mind, this seems harsh and antithetical to organizations centered on people with a Latin American ethnic identity, right? It seems harsh. But it's important to keep in mind the Hispanic Latinx label has been imposed on discrete groups of people by outsiders, right? There's no such thing as the Hispanic vote, right? So when we talk about things like Hispanic organizations or Latinx organizations, it's important to keep in mind there are plenty of ideological divides, right? Meanwhile, as Latin American and Mexican American identity-based movements grew, the broader national view of immigration was softening somewhat. After decades of harshly restrictive immigration control, we talked about this earlier, a number of political and cultural shifts converged to bring about immigration reform in 1965. First, the social Darwinism, or scientific racism, it's sometimes called, that underpinned much of the restrictionist legislation in the 1920s, it fell out of favor after the war, World War II. Anti-Nazi sentiment fueled much of this cultural about-face. Second, John F. Kennedy entered office in 1961 on a pro-immigration platform, calling for, quote, national origins quotas to be supplanted by an admissions system based on family reunion, the technical and professional needs of the country, asylum claims, and foreign policy interests, unquote. Now, there's a lot there to unpack, particularly related to immigration for foreign policy interests, but we're just going to leave that for now. Well, that could be another whole presentation. Then after Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon Johnson picked up his predecessor's promise as a plank in his own broad civil rights platform late in his first term. The result was the Immigration Act of 1965, which Johnson himself claimed was really not a revolutionary bill in an attempt to assuage kind of lingering nativist sentiment. But we all know, of course, the act did in fact usher in major change. As historian Daniel Tiekenoorb summarizes, quote, annual immigrant admissions increased sharply in the years after the law's passage. Yet its most profound impact was on the ethnic makeup of newcomers, as family unification under the new preference system led to unprecedented levels of immigration from Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Indeed, Asian and Latin American arrivals would comprise 3/4 of legal admissions in the 1970s and the 1980s, end quote. Now, of course, problems remained. After the Bracero program was closed in 1965, there was almost no mechanism at all to fulfill US agricultural demands. While the 1965 Immigration Act abolished national quotas, it established preference categories. And the 29,000 visas worldwide set aside for skilled and unskilled workers simply could not satisfy the demands of either US employers or Mexican men and women hoping to earn a higher wage. As a result, undocumented immigration has skyrocketed in the decades after 1965 with no legislative resolution in sight. Take a moment here just to ask if there are any questions before we shift from the historical portion, and I'll kick it over to Sarah here to talk about present day immigration policies. Oh yeah, sorry, Bracero. So let me put this in the chat. Thanks, Linda. Any other questions? Is everyone still awake? Don't answer that, just continue.
All right, do we remember these guys? Yeah, gross. Show me puppies. All right, so throughout much of, and this is actually my puppy, and you're probably occasionally seeing him through the window here. He's clingy. It's not my daughter, who's also waiting in the other room. It's a family business. Throughout much of US history, we've eagerly invited immigrants to the United States to satisfy labor shortages, as Aaron has just demonstrated. But as soon as we have what we need, we evict them. And sometimes through violent and immediate forced removals, like Operation Wetback. We place society's problem on the alien other and thereby legitimate the removal of persons who allegedly threaten the American way of life. In order to preserve the majority's way of life and comfort, governments often use the following 4 avenues to control the threat. So we have restrictive policies inhibiting pathways to legal status. We second have apprehension and containment within detention centers. Third, we have removal via deportation. And 4, fear of apprehension. So Aaron already ran through some of the restrictive policies throughout history, and I'm not going to spend much more time talking about them. Chinese exclusion, the Immigration Act of 1924, and demand for laborers and subsequent vilification and ejection of those laborers. Even when we got to Lyndon B. Johnson's Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which lifted the bogus quota system and restrictions on Asian immigration, we already had an unstoppable immigration machine designed to work exactly as it was meant to exclude. If we think back on the history of immigration law and policy in the United States, who designed it? People who colonized the United States, white immigrants, who at the time were men because women didn't have any political voice until the 20th century, long after the establishment of the United States and laying the foundations for the present day immigration system. The United States was founded on and continues to sit upon a white power structure. White people colonized this country. White men ruled this country and made sure that more white people were able to more easily immigrate, ensuring white power in the United States. And any subsequent modification or tweaking of the immigration machine was just fine-tuning of a machine that was designed to perpetuate white influence and power in the United States. So I want to take a deeper dive into more recent immigration policies to understand how this really plays out in more recent history. We, of course, can't talk about history of immigration policy without talking about 9/11. This was a reactionary turning point for the crackdown on undocumented immigrants in the United States. And I imagine most of us here tonight remember this day and the fear it inspired in us. This one isolated event would serve as political fuel to ignite fear and sway citizens' heart with televised evidence of the threat of those hailing from foreign lands. The government didn't isolate the fear to a single terrorist group, but instead applied the fear to all foreigners, all alien others, sweeping up in their net undocumented laborers who had been longtime residents of the United States. The Patriot Act and creation of the Department of Homeland Security followed in the years after the attack. So Epson Furman wrote about President Bush in 2003, and President Bush announced Operation Endgame, whose mission consisted of a 10-year plan as proclaimed by the Department of Homeland Security to promote the public safety and national security by ensuring the departure from the United States of all removable aliens. So we've got Operation Endgame. This is an actual political policy not to be confused with the 2010 Zach Galifianakis film involving rogue agents and rival spies. But before we get to Operation Endgame, let's backtrack a few years to 1996 and the Clinton administration and understand the groundwork that paved the way for some of these Bush era changes. So in 1996, we had an Immigration Reform Act, which was signed into law by President Bill Clinton. Green card holders convicted of even the most minor of crimes could be stripped of their legal status and shipped out of the country. Before 1996, there were only 4 categories of crimes that would have led to the expulsion of a legal permanent resident. The immigration law expanded the number of crimes that could lead to removal of over 50, and so broadly defined their terms that a combination of shoplifting and not turning a library book could be considered enough to get a person expelled. And I should mention, I guess at this point, that that same act also created a number of restrictions that have now made it almost impossible for many of the 12 million undocumented immigrants living in the country today to regularize or legalize their immigration status. So it was a super restrictive policy that passed in 1996. In that article that I keep quoting, written by the professors Epps and Furman at the University of Tacoma, in 2003, President Bush announced Operation Endgame, whose mission consisted of a 10-year plan as proclaimed by the Department of Homeland Security to promote the public safety and national security by ensuring the departure from the United States, again, of all removable aliens. So in one single sentence, DHS characterized all undocumented immigrants as the dangerous other, meaning if the people of the United States are to be safe and the country secure, every undocumented immigrant must be apprehended, detained, and removed from our society, end quote. So even though Operation Endgame didn't specifically identify wetbacks or Chinese or Japanese, the policy is still reminiscent of the 1954 Operation Wetback, especially when we look at the statistics. So just 7 years after the program began in 2010, 97% of all deportees were Latino. And of those 73% were Mexican nationals. Let's just take a minute to soak those numbers in. Nearly all deported immigrants in 2010 were Latinx. Next up, we've got Operation Streamline. So in 2005, this is another Bush era policy. The sole purpose of this is to criminalize undocumented immigrants. The goal of the policy was to deter immigrants from crossing the US-Mexican border by prosecuting immigrants for undocumented entries, resulting in a misdemeanor or felony conviction. Prior to this, criminal prosecution was reserved only for repeat entrants. The result of Operation Streamline is an unprecedented increase in criminal caseloads, quadrupling after Operation Streamline's implementation, creating immense burdens for the district courts along the border, diverting critical resources from serious criminal proceedings while also creating an immensely lucrative opportunity for private prison companies. In order to efficiently move immigrants prosecuted under Operation Streamline through the court system, they are tried conjointly in groups of between 40 and 80 defendants, like you're seeing up on the screen here, including providing legal counsel by a group lawyer. That doesn't sound like due process to me. Prior to Operation Streamline, unauthorized entry was a civil violation. So you've got civil law and criminal law. This was a civil violation. It's now prosecuted as a serious crime, but only for those select immigrants crossing the US-Mexico border in specifically designated areas. In 2013, almost 100,000 non-citizens were prosecuted from unauthorized border crossings. And this is an increase of 76.2% since 2009. The Pew Research Center reports, quote, the increase in illegal reentry convictions over the past 2 decades accounts for 48% of the growth in total federal court convictions, end quote. Border prosecutions are also responsible for the most significant growth in border detention since 2005, resulting in severe overpopulation of federal prisons. Next, we have secure communities. They were really original with the names of these policies. It was first introduced in 2008. And it requires jails to run fingerprints of all arrestees through ICE databases, regardless of whether the arrestee is charged with a crime. The Obama administration further expanded the program, and this particular program remains in place despite resistance from cities, counties, and states nationwide who see it as a threat to public safety, creating diminished trust in law enforcement. Our own county doesn't like to cooperate with this particular policy. The program raises legitimate question of racial profiling or pretextual arrests. About the program, ICE writes, quote, ICE prioritizes the removal of criminal aliens, those who pose a threat to public safety and repeat immigration violators. So breaking this down, ICE declares this program will focus on 1, immigrants who are criminal, 2, immigrants who are a threat to the safety of others, and 3, immigrants who are repeat violators of immigration regulations. So the big question now, or questions, who is a criminal? Who is a threat? And who gets to decide these things? Without a clear definition, it's a little tricky determining who is a criminal. Thankfully for us, ICE provides a definition. Criminal aliens, I quote, are immigrants who have been convicted of a crime by a court of law. This conviction may occur in the United States or overseas, provided that the overseas conviction is one that is recognized in the United States, end quote. Great, it's really helpful. Any crime, stealing a pack of gum crime, dog off a leash crime. Perhaps the most ambiguous is threat to public safety. This is a gray area that is cause for concern when the ambiguity involves the distinct possibility of an individual's liberty being revoked or their family and home disseminated. If we apply the same reasoning of Operation Endgame, all undocumented immigrants are deemed a threat to public safety, and the other 2 ICE criteria are really without purpose. Furthermore, ICE and current and past administrations have explicitly stated their #1 priority for removal, and I guess I shouldn't say current anymore, this has been changed under the Biden administration, but have explicitly stated their #1 priority for removal is to pursue criminal immigrants. Now, I guess Biden has said that as well, never mind. It's just, he's changed a little bit the ICE priorities, the enforcement priorities. Remember the mantra of the Obama administration, felons, not families. The enforcement statistics tell a much different story. Shame on you, Obama. In 2010, 3,600 people apprehended under the secure communities were US citizens. 79% of immigrants deported were deemed non-criminal or without charge or conviction. It doesn't sound like felons to me. The graph up on the screen probably most clearly illustrates this data. The red line shows the non-criminal arrests under secure communities. In 2010, the number of non-criminal arrests spikes, showing ICE arrested more people with no criminal history than any other category, a total of 61,234 at the time of the National Immigration Forum published this graph in 2011. In the second graph, click, there you go. In the second graph, you can see clearly that at the time the data was published, non-criminal arrests far exceeded the level 1 serious crime arrest. So that's that blue line. So Secure Communities was suspended under the Obama administration in November 2014 through January 2017. But then the Trump administration reinstated it on January 25, 2017. ICE boasts more than 43,300 convicted criminal aliens have been removed as a result of Secure Communities since its reactivation. Again, though, roughly 3/4 of those were removed without actual criminal conviction. I'm just going to go back and repeat that. Roughly 3/4 of those removed were without actual criminal conviction. This demonstrates once again, this was likely a pretense for expedited removals. Quoting ICE, once again, explaining Secure Communities, quote, "It is an initiative to help DHS identify removable aliens arrested for crimes. At all times, ICE retains authority to make appropriate decisions against removable aliens consistent with its priorities and resources based on individual facts and circumstances, regardless of whether a criminal conviction is obtained." As well as reinstating Secure Communities on January 25, 2017, the Trump administration signed an executive order, Border Security and Immigration Enforcement Improvements, which called for the construction of an impassable southern wall or border, the increased use of detention at the border and in the interior, expansion of detention capacity in private prison corporations, expansion of expedited removals, increase in the number of 287G agreements. So this is a contract allowing local law enforcement agents to act as immigration officials, because that's a really good idea. Conducting removal proceedings outside of the United States, limiting humanitarian protection, and prioritizing criminal prosecution of unauthorized entries. This particular executive order also strengthened ICE's ability to profile the community and detain those they suspected to be in the country unlawfully. The order didn't specify the burden of proof ICE needed to satisfy in order to arrest someone on suspicion of unlawful presence, granting them broad powers to profile at will. I remember when this was passed and there was a lot of education that went on where we discussed, what do people who look brown, who look like other, who don't look white, who don't look like, what ICE thinks a US citizen should look like, what do they need to do to ensure that they are not swept up in ICE arrests? And so what ended up happening is we had a lot of Latinx folks carrying around their US birth certificates or their US passports of proof of lawful status in case this did happen. But we know, in fact, that that didn't necessarily matter, because even here locally, we had someone who was a former Marine who was swept up by ICE, and they attempted to deport him, even though they did see that he had a US passport. This is the extent of the profiling that was happening under the Secure Communities policy. All right, so 2 days after the Trump administration passed that particular executive order, the administration signed what is commonly known as the Muslim or travel ban. This was an executive order banning refugees from any country for 120 days, indefinitely barring Syrian refugees, barring entrance from people from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, and it prioritized refugee claims of certain religious minorities. This, and basically what they're saying is Christian refugees. This iteration of the ban was blocked. A new iteration of the ban was issued in March of that same year, 2017. That issue, or that version, corrected some of the issues the courts had with the first ban. Nonetheless, it was again blocked. And finally, Travel Ban 3.0 was unveiled on September 27th of 2017. And then in December 2017, the Supreme Court allowed the travel ban to take effect. Of immigration changes during the Trump administration, a researcher for the Cato Institute writes, Trump was wildly successful in reducing legal immigration. By November 2020, the Trump administration reduced the number of green cards issued to people abroad by at least, I'm going to summary, 420,000, and the number of non-immigrant visas by at least 11.1 million during his first term through November 2020. He took office with a goal of reducing illegal immigration and instead reduced legal immigration. President Trump used the pandemic as a way to entirely halt the issuance of immigrant visas produced abroad. Non-immigrant visas experienced the same decline at the outset of the pandemic. On average, non-immigrant visas were already down by 12% under the Trump administration, but then were completely halted in late March 2020. At the same time, Interior Immigration Enforcement also collapsed, resulting in the lowest removal rates since 2003. Local jurisdictions refused to cooperate with his administration, and therefore removal rates were down, allowing the number of undocumented immigrants to remain roughly the same as when he took office. So despite the call to get in line and do it the legal way, the Trump administration took over 400 steps to impede lawful immigration to the United States, culminating in the complete shutdown of the immigration machine in March 2020. On to Biden. Things aren't looking super great under the Biden administration. Continued pandemic conditions, the economy, climate change are making it challenging for the administration to advance any other agendas, and record border detentions paint an ugly picture. In reality, record migration rates are in line with past trends and are likely a reflection of what happens when a border completely shuts down for nearly 18 months and then reopens, allowing people to begin attempting to re-enter again. It's like a dam stopping the flow of water. It's the same amount of water that would ordinarily flow through that waterway, but coming all at once. Biden has promised big changes, and trust me, back in January, I was feeling all the love for Biden and really loving all the things that he was saying about immigration reform. But much like Obama, he's encountering resistance in Congress and elsewhere, and he's finding it really difficult to unravel the hundreds of changes made by the Trump administration, described by one policy analyst as a tangled, knotted ball of sewing thread, impossible to undo. Currently, Biden is trying to push immigration reform by way of a social spending bill, possibly the last chance to achieve reforms to the immigration system before the 2022 midterm election. If Republicans gain the majority in Congress, chances are low of winning any protections for immigrants. This reform is the first of its kind in over 35 years, so it's big, but it's tenuous. The sweeping immigration proposals made by Biden in January are unlikely to happen, especially considering he hasn't even rolled back some of the most criticized policies of the Trump administration. His plan seems to be let Congress sort it out.
So we're pretty much at the end here, and we're just wondering, are there any kind of concluding questions? Any questions you have so far here before we wrap up?
Someone said they're wide awake. Good.
Okay.
Great information.
Did families come to work the sugar beet industry during the 1920s? Yes, yes, it was around that time. Yep, during the 1920s, and then through really the World War period, as folks shifted into more industrial labor at that point, right? So Heinz pickling factory, the Holland St. Louis sugar factory, as opposed to working in the fields. Yeah.
So from Ricky, we've got currently many hospitality and agricultural businesses have been voicing their unhappiness with the current immigration policies because they need those individuals for their workforce. Has that happened in the past with other policies enacted over the decades? If so, what has been the reaction by various administrations?
That is an excellent question, Ricky. I'm not sure, honestly. I mean,
so we have amnesty in the late 80s under the Reagan administration. So that was one response, and that came in multiple forms, and that resulted in the ability of millions, really, of undocumented immigrants to legalize their immigration status. And so that was one response to a similar situation in the 80s. But again, it was kind of like a one-time fix, and it wasn't something intended to fix this immigration machine that works to exclude. And so as a result, what we saw happening was, so a bunch of people were able to regularize or legalize their immigration status. And then that kind of inspired a movement of people from, this hemisphere, basically north, thinking that they might be able to get immigration status in the United States or find work. And so we saw a really, really big uptick in the number of undocumented immigrants in the United States that finally stopped in 2009. But again, like I mentioned, in 1996, the Clinton administration passed that really restrictive immigration reform, which basically trapped people in the United States, because if they left, they would be subject to a 10-year bar or a permanent bar, which would prevent them from legally re-entering the United States. So that as a result, we have about 12 million people, and I don't know of those how many are subject to the 1996 restrictions, but a lot of those people, I think, are stuck not being able to legalize their status because of the restrictions in 1996. All of them, I'm sure, would love to be documented. It is not fun to be undocumented. It's not ideal. That's kind of a myth that people like to be undocumented and live in the shadows and fear, for, the unification of their family, and wonder whether or not they're going to be able to come home after work to their children. People don't want to live like that. They do want to legalize their status, but they're unable to because of the way the laws are written right now.
And as a follow-up to that, Ricky, I'll hazard to say this, and that is, in the past, as we've seen during the Great Depression and then during World War II, when the United States kind of opened, or rather before the Great Depression in the 20s, and then again during World War II, the U.S. government and agricultural business particularly were much more strongly linked. And basically the agricultural lobby had a lot more clout within the federal government. And so we had these more, I guess, tolerant policies about bringing in laborers. And then when the agricultural industry said, we're done, we've got a depression or we've got a glut on the market, again, the federal government was quick to kick people out. Now, unfortunately, there's another business interest that has a bit more clout. As I'm sure many of you know, the United States actually incarcerates more people than any other country in the rest of the world. Even after all the, even after removing folks from detention during the pandemic, we still incarcerate 1.8 million people. That incarceration machine that is compounded by a supervision machine. So there are also the companies that make all the ankle monitors and other things that get attached to folks who have come into this country. And so that industry now also has a lot more say in Congress. And so there's a competing business interest against, calls by agriculture for more workers. There's the competing calls by folks who are in charge of supervision and incarceration saying, no, we would like more, more restrictive policy. And they're the ones who get heard lately, it seems. Mm-hmm. Linda, excellent point here, right? It seems to me that neither political party holds the moral high ground. A depressing truth, right? Absolutely right. It's not at all one party is really trying to push for reforms and doing the right thing. It's both parties really see people who are new to this country as very easy targets for political wins, and just don't count for much as far as votes are concerned, right? So the most vulnerable populations are the first to be forgotten and the first to be dismissed, right? And so it's a depressing truth.
Well, current procedure for people to obtain naturalization is there a quota for different countries. So yeah, there is a quota system. So no more than 7% of all visas issued in 1 year can go to one single country. So that's why if you look at the visa bulletin, you'll see that we have one column for countries of all chargeability, another column for Mexico, India, Philippines, and China. And it's because those 4 countries send a lot of immigrants to the United States. And so there's a major backlog for those particular countries versus those of all chargeability. So that's our current quota system. In order to obtain naturalization, you first have to be a permanent resident in the United States. Permanent residency is obtained through 4 different avenues. So family-based immigration, employment-based immigration, some sort of humanitarian remedy. So this could be refugee status, it could be asylum. There are some other remedies for people who are victims of trafficking or violent crimes or domestic violence, sexual assault. And then finally, there's the diversity lottery. So only 4 ways that you can come to the United States as a lawful permanent resident. And after typically being a lawful permanent resident for 5 years, then you can apply to naturalize. In some cases, children can derive citizenship from US citizen parents, but on the whole, when we're talking about immigrants, we're talking about people who first are lawful permanent residents and then they naturalize.
So I'm going to answer one last question here and then we'll wrap up real quick. But Linda, again, so prior to the 1860s, was there just a completely open door to any immigrant to the US? So yes, as it happens, right? Anybody could come now. However, remember that late 19th century restriction, right? That naturalization was restricted to quote white person, right? I forget the phrase exactly that was used, but it was restricted to people who were deemed white at the time. And so remember, in the 18th century, and then again, leading obviously into the 19th century here, as you asked, white people would have excluded Southern Europeans, would have excluded anybody of Jewish descent, right? So people we may not think of necessarily as non-white now were certainly considered non-white at the time. So yeah, but nevertheless, it was a much more open place, right, to come to at any rate, right?
And it's just one of those, again, myths where people, will say, and I've heard this a lot of times, well, why can't they just do it the legal way like my ancestors did? And we have to stop and remember that prior to 1924, especially those who are entering through Ellis Island, like there was no legal way, there was no formal immigration system. And so to say that they should just do it the legal way like my ancestors is really quite unfair, because the system that we have in place today did not exist back then. It was much easier to come into the United States, as long as, again, you looked white, you didn't have any diseases, and yeah.
Right, so to just real quick in conclusion here, all of this really just scrapes the surface, and yes, we have our happy swirl here. All of this just scrapes the surface of the broader environment that LAUP's founders were operating in when they established in 1964 the organization that would later become Latin Americans United for Progress, and as they continued to work in the community for the next 60 years. Holland's leaders, political, cultural, and social, have long portrayed the town as a community of immigrants. We haven't told that story tonight, right? It is a familiar one, nevertheless, to anyone who attends Tulip Time in the spring, or Sinterklaas Eve tomorrow night, for example. It is a story of people seeking religious freedom, of taming a wilderness and harnessing a river, of building an abundant, prolific, and tradition-oriented community. Another story is told about the people who immigrated to this region a few years later. In that story, people come to work and take money out of the community, take advantage of that community's generosity, and stubbornly cling to their own language and inferior culture. Both stories are false. It would be better to tell a different story, one that emphasizes the commonalities among all community members. In both the mid-19th century and the early 20th century, people came to this region, which frankly, and as we know, had been populated long before either arrived, to find better economic opportunities and to flee persecution. People both adapted to their new circumstances and retained older ways of doing things. LAUP has long worked to tell this different story. Visit the museum to learn more about what that other story might look like, and work together with LAUP for a better tomorrow together. Again, thank you so much for having us. It's been our pleasure. We hope you heard us well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Aaron and Sarah, for just such an eye-opening and informative and impactful presentation. It's just so important that this information and this history is known and shared for the betterment of our community. So we just really can't thank you enough for doing this and being here this evening. Thank you to all of our audience members as well for their great questions and comments. And just to remind you that the recording link and a survey link will be sent probably in the next couple of days. And we hope that all of you will join us again soon for future programs through the Holland Museum. And I thank you all, and I wish you a good evening. So thank you very much.